I started graduate school January of 68, and at the end of the first term, I don't know what possessed me to do this. I called my draft office and I said, I need to know whether I should sign up for another term. And this woman, whose name I don't recall, said to me, yeah, I think you can get one more term in. I think we'll probably get you in the fall. Call me at the end of the summer term. So in August, I call her back and she says, you might get one more term in, but let me suggest this to you. If you get one more term in, you'll come back in 2 years and have only one term left of graduate school. You're going to need that first term to readjust. She said, we're definitely going to get you. I'm going to suggest you volunteer, enlist for 2 years, and come back with two terms less. I mean, this was motherly advice. And I wish I could remember her name because I took her advice. I mean, I had tried desperately at the last minute to get into all kinds of reserve units, and it's like, nah, too late. And so I went to the enlistment station, and the recruiter was nice enough to say, you know what? Because you're enlisting, you're going to have your choice of MOSs, military operational specialties. I said, well, great. I have an undergraduate degree in psychology. I have half of a master's in business administration. Well, that was sort of the first lie. I was tracked for 11 Bravo 10 light weapons infantry right from the start. Um, so I went in October of 68, and then 12 months later, rotated into Vietnam.
I mean, with undergrad degree and grad school, did you consider going in as an officer? Why did you choose the enlistment route?
Oh, second lieutenant's life expectancy at that point, there was this sort of, these little one-liners that go around. The second lieutenant has a 30-minute life expectancy in Vietnam.
Mm.
It would have required 10 months more of active duty. And I kind of weighed that up and I thought, seems like a very vulnerable position. I want to get in and out as rapidly as I can. I don't think at that point I knew about NCO school, but NCO school did not require additional time on active duty. And I said, that's it. I can eliminate a layer or two of control. And that's the course I took.
So now NCO school, does that mean basically you jump right away to E5?
Uh, you're if you graduated, and most guys did, you were E5. Six of us were honors graduates and made E6. So I came out of, which incidentally was a bone of contention with lifetime soldiers. I'd been in the Army like 8 months and I was an E6. There were guys who had been in the Army for years and hadn't achieved that rank. So there was sort of a built-in resentment. We were called Jiffy Pops, Shake and Bakes. In the last phase of my training, it was an OJT phase where I was a training NCO. Our company commander really disliked us. He was a Mustang, which is a term used for a guy who was an NCO who then went through OCS and became an officer. He was a Mustang, and boy, he just had a tremendous distaste for us.
Was that a challenge when you get into Vietnam? I mean, you have the privilege of rank, going, so quickly to E6. But of course, the responsibility of rank as well. And, I'm just thinking if you've got E3s who've been in country for 6 months and you're just showing up, how did
Yep.
how did you work that out?
My first 2 weeks there, the prior platoon sergeant was there. He was he was really short. He only had 2 weeks to go. And he said to me, don't try to assert a lot of authority. Follow me around. I will get you through your first 2 weeks. That is the same advice I gave other people, including the second lieutenant who came in to replace our wounded second lieutenant after the ambush. I said to him, his call sign was 2-6. I said, 2-6, I will not do anything to usurp your authority, but follow me around, ask me questions. I'll get you through the first couple of weeks. So that was sort of the way things went. If you were pretty aware you would know that as an FNG, an effing new guy, you didn't know anything. And almost without exception, guys were grateful for those couple weeks of tutelage. We did have one forward observer who wouldn't listen, always had to go out monkeying around with things. On an operation, there was a bicycle leaning up against a stone wall. He had to go over and mess with it. It blew up. Took him about 20 minutes to die. And everybody was shaking their heads saying, we told him. We told him not to mess with stuff.
It sounds like, just based on what you were saying a few minutes ago, it sounds like you didn't have a whole lot of interest in going to Vietnam. What was your take on the war when you're in grad school, thinking about the possibility of still having to go into the army? I mean, what did this Vietnam thing look like to you at that time?
You ask a question that I have pondered for a long time. Remembering that we grew up, I was born in 1945. My contemporaries, most of their dads served in the war. A noble cause, rid the world of fascism. Somewhere in the back of our mind, I think we all had programmed that we will have a war sometime. And it will be a just war. By the time I was pulled out of graduate school, I really felt ambivalent about it. There were indications that we weren't there to win. There was this ambivalence in the air that you're going to serve your country, and that at some depth in my subconscious felt okay. Your war is a rotten war. Your war is now just a war of attrition, and that's different from your dad's war. So I had that sort of mixture of feelings kind of brewing inside of me. And I also saw that this was pretty much a one-way street. Whatever I might have done a couple semesters earlier to avoid active duty, the moment was past, I was there.
So you've described kind of how were thinking about the war before you go into the military. Now let's put you on the plane when you're flying out. Your tour is done, and let's say either in your own mind or the soldier next to you asks, "So what was that all about? Why were we here the last year?" What do you think you would have said then?
By the time I flew home, and I incidentally don't remember much about the trip home, whether it was the depths of fatigue, trauma, who knows? But I didn't want to examine it. I didn't want to dissect it. And I don't think I really wanted an understanding of the role that I had played. So things became even more ambivalent on the way home. And of course, as you've heard from so many of the other guys you've interviewed, there was this embarrassed silence when we get home.
What was your first impression of Vietnam?
The smell. Well, no, actually, when we flew into Tan Son Nhut, we were put on buses and taken over to a processing center, I think Benoit, and there were RPG guards on the windows of the bus. That was my first impression of, we're in a combat zone. This is serious. And during processing, which I think took place overnight and into the following day, out on the perimeter, you'd hear a gunshot or two, and it reminded you, yeah, we're in a war zone. So that was my first impression. When they flew me up to Cu Chi and I got off the plane, the smell was my first impression there. And I was like, I don't know that I'll ever get used to this. Well, within about 30 minutes, you got used to it.
Right. So you arrive in South Vietnam as an E6, and what is your basic job then through your tour?
Um, while I was out in the field, uh, in the role of platoon sergeant, I had to put together ambush patrols, work with my squad leaders to be sure various things that we were tasked with were accomplished. I had to make life easy easier for the platoon leader. And that was basically my job.
So out in the field, you are the platoon sergeant in a mechanized unit. So what does that mean? What are you, when you're getting ready for an operation, as the operation's unfolding, what are you doing as the platoon sergeant in a mechanized?
Um, Being second in command of the platoon, I had to make sure our four armored personnel carriers were squared away. Guys were squared away. Guys had ammo with them, readily accessible. I commanded one of I think it was the third squad. 2-6, the lieutenant commanded the first one. So he was on track one, I was on track three. We had helmets that had walkie-talkie capacity, so we would talk to each other. And if we needed to split up and do something, 2 tracks going here, 2 tracks going there, that would be under my responsibility.
What kinds of operations are you going out on?
What are called RIFs, reconnaissance and force, patrolling areas that had been heavily defoliated, which is why Agent Orange, I think, is one of the gifts that Vietnam gave me. Those would be on mounted rifts because we could cover more room, more territory. Dismounted rifts, jungle areas, sweeps of villages. There were some villages around in our area that we suspected were VC controlled. Looking for tunneling activity, and not only emptying the tunnels, but blowing them up so that they couldn't be used again. So we had demolition stuff with us. Those were the kinds of and then ambush patrols. And we set out ambush patrols virtually every night. My job was not only to assemble those, but to go out on them periodically too. And that's one of the things I made sure my guys understood. I'm just not ordering you out on an ambush patrol so I can get a good night's sleep here. I will go out on every X, third, fourth one the same way you do.
Obviously, you mentioned the Agent Orange, and looking back now, we see just the huge ramifications of this. And I think that, you're dealing with that personally. But at the time, well, first of all, what I hear from vets is at the time they didn't really think anything of it. Um, and then at the time, did it seem like something that was good to have because of the defoliation? It, makes it
Yeah,
harder for the VC to hide.
yeah, yeah. You had a lot more visibility. And on mounted rifts out in defoliated areas, we would also get on the ground. Soil was typically very sandy in that area. And we'd look for footprints, which if it were still heavily foliaged, you wouldn't have seen it. We were on a mounted rift one day in a defoliated area, and 2 of my guys and I got off the track. We thought we saw something on the ground look like a footprint, barefoot, and it was big. And there was sort of a mythology that a big footprint could be a communist Chinese advisor.
Mm.
So we start moving through an area, and all of a sudden, in the bushes, which are now skeleton bushes because of the defoliation, I see a pair of eyes, and I yell "gook," and all 3 of us just open up fire. We could not stop firing. We kept reloading more magazines and firing. I mean, it was just talk about a mechanical response. I broke and went back to one of the other APCs and said, "We got a gook up here." By the time we stopped, this individual was almost unrecognizable as a human being. What was really tough about it was we had to go through his pockets. There was a big wad of currency, which led us to believe he was a Viet Cong paymaster. And then one of my guys pulls a wallet out of this guy's back pocket. Family picture. Him, his wife, his 2 little kids. I don't remember much about the next 2 weeks. I was just blown away. The one thing I do recall is one of my guys wanted to have his picture taken with the remains, kind of holding up the guy's head like a big game hunter.
Mm.
I don't know that I believe in karma, but 3 months later, that guy was dead. But I don't remember much about the next 2 weeks. I was really in shock. Um, you demonize your enemy so that you can dispatch him as quickly as possible. You show him a family picture, and that's very humanizing. And that was tough.
Well, it's interesting because it seems like you're touching on just how complicated the world of war can be. You know, you see this photo and you have this response of, wow, that was a human being with a family. But the other guy has and to me, both of these responses are they're not difficult to understand, just given human psychology. The other guy's response is, hey, this is the enemy. We just wiped him out. That's awesome. I want to take a picture. Um, I mean, it sounds to me like you've got encapsulated in this little story. I mean, these two, you know, opposite responses to the world of war, both of which, in my mind, make some sense in that context.
Yeah. Well, throughout your training, the enemy is demonized. And there were a number of epithets for those guys: gooks, dinks, zipperheads. Just there was this whole array of derogatory terms that helped us keep an emotional distance from these guys. And that's you're right. That's what has to happen.
Have you thought back on that story and just kind of said, you know, thank God that for whatever reason, um, I was able at that moment to empathize with this guy. When I saw the picture, that I hadn't yet been transformed so much by the world of war that I still had a human response to that photo. Have you ever looked back on that and kind of thought about it that way?
That's an interesting question. I think it underlines the ambiguity. Both sets of perceptions exist. Um, we captured two, I think, NVAs out of a buried tunnel at one point, and they were treated rather roughly, bound, blindfolded, pushed around a little bit until battalion intelligence came out. And before we blindfolded this one guy, I looked into his eyes and I saw this abject fear. And I understood it. I understood it. And fortunately, there was nothing that I was going to be doing to interact with that guy, but you could have these flashes of humanity arise that for a moment would take you over to the other side. I always got back on the warfare side pretty quickly just because that's what you had to do. We were set up one night out in a very open area. Our platoon had 3 squads that were straight infantry, and a fourth was a mortar squad. And anytime we'd set up for the night, these guys would set up their mortar. I think it was a 4.2 mortar. These guys were a little better educated than the rest of the troops. I really liked them. I had more in common with them. And one night we were set up in an open area, and all of a sudden there's kind of a splatter of gunfire that comes in. One round hits off of the mortar platoon's APC and buries itself into one of the mortar guys' stomachs.
Hmm.
As luck would have it, it was a tracer round. So the phosphorus was still cooking off inside of him. And he was just screaming bloody murder. I could tell the color of the tracer was red, which meant it was ours. Charlie had green tracers. We had red tracers. So it was friendly fire. And they were continuing to, from whatever that site was, splatter some rounds around, we finally got on the phone with, I guess, battalion, and it turns out it was a Wolfhound unit, second of the 27th, I think. And they had no awareness that we were out there. And it was like, what the hell? We got a medevac chopper in as quickly as we could. This guy was absolutely in agony. Um, they flew him out. I felt so badly for the mortar guys because they had absolutely lost an immediate family member. And my perception was that he didn't make it, but I'm not sure about that. But that friendly fire incident was very sobering. For about 4 weeks, we were doing air mobile assaults out of Hueys. I don't know why it was us, but we parked our APCs and we were going into landing zones on choppers. And that was the most frightening experience for me because you couldn't tell. You know, you get some radio communication. It's a hot LZ. Okay, we're going in under fire. Or it's a cold LZ. There's nobody around. And the assessment wasn't always right. And the choppers would come in and you'd jump out when it was about 4 feet off the ground. And the noise was so deafening, you didn't know whether you were under fire. The only way you could tell was if somebody next to you dropped, you were under fire. And I still find I have a very active emotional response when thinking about that because there was really nothing you could do. You were headed for a wood line as fast as you could. The group on the ground had popped smoke, and whatever color that was, that's where they wanted you to come in. If Charlie had the same color smoke in a different part of the LZ, he'd pop it. You might run in the wrong direction. You might run right into him. So there was just this rampant uncertainty. And when you finally got into the wood line and you kind of regather, you just take a deep sigh and say, all right, what are we here to do? Stand down that we had, I think in January, which was 3 days long, I only recall one other instance where we were in base camp overnight. They did a great job of getting the world's finest steaks and baked potatoes, and we just chowed down. I think that was only that one instance. The rest of the time, we were kind of in motion.
Did you have any guys who just, after several months of this, just couldn't do it anymore?
I don't recall any instances of that. Um, the squads really built a sense of camaraderie. I mean, my several squads, they created an identity for themselves. Um, so there was that. I don't recall anybody literally walking up and saying, I can't go on.
Well, in combat vets, they often say that as terrible as war is, as they look back on it, if you can say there's anything that they, quote unquote, miss about that world, the one thing they do say is there is that sense of that tightness with the guys, that sense of meaning. It's an interesting thing because the context we're in, this all might just be pointless and it makes no sense, but yet at the same time, there's tremendous meaning in what we're doing with and among ourselves, our group, looking out. I'm looking out for the soldier next to me. He's looking out for me. And a lot of it say, that never gets replaced anywhere else after the war, and they do find themselves in some ways missing that a little bit. Is that true for you?
There's a dichotomy here. That closeness that you're talking about, and don't get too close,
Mm-hmm.
you could die tomorrow.
That's right. Yeah.
And I can't tell you where along that spectrum I generally lived. We were out at a site very close to the Cambodian border, and it was just I think as I recall, there were like 8 tracks, so it would have been 2 squads. Um, and we were told there's an NVA regiment further up the Ho Chi Minh Trail that is probably going to come through your area tonight. we are not able to provide you with artillery support or air support. You're on your own. And we were told, dig in under your APCs and maintain 100% watch through the night. Well, we dug in so that we had shelter. We were going to stay on 100% watch that night just because of this. That afternoon, a lot of guys wrote the letter that you never wanted to write.
Mm.
If you get this letter, I didn't make it. Sweetie, I love you. Well, Papo and I wrote our letters, exchanged our letters, put them in our pockets. So if I survived, I could get Papo's letter back to his people. Same. What was interesting was that early that evening, we came under mortar fire that almost precisely outlined where the armored personnel carriers were, but 100 yards away. So somebody had been stepping off distances to call in mortar fire. When the air cleared from that, we were just awake all night, waiting for what would have been 400 or more well-trained NVA to just come through. The first rays of sun shone in the morning. We all kind of looked at each other. Papo took out my letter, handed it back to me. I took out his letter, handed it back to him. We made it. That kind of closeness was monumental, no question about it. Something I came to learn about personal actions out in the field. In one circumstance, you could be what's called heroic. Run into problems, solve them, save your guys. The next moment, your knees could turn to jelly and you're incapable of performance. I never knew where on that spectrum it was. The line between heroism and cowardice was always in my mind and unresolved. I mean, I didn't have really a formula, but you were always wondering, the next time it hits the fan, can I get out and do what needs to be done? And that was kind of a big shadow hanging over you because you didn't know. And there were times where I saw guys do heroic things, and there were times when guys just froze and were useless.
So what would you have told yourself on the plane, going home if the question popped into your head, so how did I do?
The ultimate measure for me was, did I lose any of my guys? And I had two guys wounded in a booby trap. My guys, when I was out in the field, two guys wounded, nobody killed. I came home with that sense of comfort that I had done my job. The guys I lost, particularly over in Cambodia, it took me some emotional gymnastics to say, you couldn't have saved them. You guys went down the wrong road. But I came home saying, yeah, under my guidance, we only had 2 injuries. When I got the base camp job, I got to tell you, it was something to this day that baffles me. A lifer, an E7, said to me, Fleming, I was back there for something in the rear area. He said, I'm heading home next week. I've got a base camp job. I'd like to have you take that job over. I didn't care what that job was. I said, I'm in. By the way, what's the job?
Wow.
I was in charge of 24 South Vietnamese nationals that came through the front gate every day. They had pass cards and had supposedly background checks. And they were tasked with hooch maids, kitchen help, people working out in the common areas, burning human waste.
Wow.
Um, and I was also in charge of what was called the Battalion Sundry Fund. We would collect money, and I don't remember exactly how, from our guys out in the field. I would buy skids of beer and soda and then have them choppered out to the field. When I was out in the field, I don't remember paying for it, but I just remember that room temperature beer would show up at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're in a secure enough area you can have a couple beers. And I just remember, boy, did I love that.
And so this is the job you have. Is it your last 5 months in country?
About 4 months.
About four. And so your job is to oversee the South Vietnamese civilians who are coming onto base, the hooch maids and the folks doing the laundry and burning the mess and all that stuff. Um, what's involved in that job? And I mean, the first one of the first things that comes to my mind is, to what extent did you think you could trust that these folks are, at the very least, passing information to the Viet Cong?
Um, I'll tell you the ultimate irony. One of these women clearly sort of was all the rest of the South Vietnamese looked up to her, and she spoke pretty good English. You could tell she was bright, um, and so she was sort of the foreman, if you will, that would help me out. Um, in 1981 or 1982, a book was published called The Tunnels of Cu Chi. And it really went into detail about that honeycomb mess underneath the base camp. It also mentioned who was the primary Viet Cong contact from within the camp. It was this girl.
Sure.
At that point, I threw up my hands. I said, of course, the person that I trusted most to help me do my job was a Viet Cong coordinator, if you will.
Did you ever have any little thoughts at the time?
No, not one. We had no indication among any of these people that they were working for the bad guys. They were being paid on a regular basis. They were eating pretty well because we provide lunch. And those jobs on the base camp were coveted. They were coveted.
Sure.
But I never really knew what the clearance process was, and obviously it wasn't foolproof.